Welcome back to Cognitive Psychology 120A. This week, I would like to focus on the question of how does information from the world reach our senses, get transformed into electrochemical signals that the brain can elaborate, and then from these signals, the brain somehow reconstructs a model of what is out there. And this process we refer to as sensation, which is the transformation of external forms of energy into the language of the brain, electrochemical signals. And then the process of taking these sensations and turning them into interpretations of what is out there in the world, into models of what is out there in the world, we refer to as perception. And as you'll remember from last week, typically, sensation tends to be fairly underspecified and often very ambiguous, which means there are a lot of ways that we could interpret the patterns of sensation that reach us. And this means there's high computational complexity. Now, interestingly, our minds have evolved a way of reconstructing what is out there nonetheless. So in this sense, perception is really an inferential process. Our brains have evolved certain strategies, certain guiding principles, certain biases that allow us to infer, given the ambiguous pattern of stimulation that we receive, what is the most likely state of the world that is originating such a perception, such a sensation. And from there, I want to go down the pathway of perception. So how do we segment sensations into different areas, different objects? How do we group different areas and lines to make coherent and stable objects? And from there, how do we recognize the identity of what is in front of us? And for this last part, we will look at two different theories, in fact, three, but two families of theories, so-called template matching theories and feature matching theories. And then lastly, I will want to cover top-down effects. The fact that perception is not just a passive processing of what comes in, what you already know actually influences and biases the way in which you process incoming sensory stimulation. Now, on what would be Thursday's lecture, I want to cover instead the brain side of this, and I will focus in particular on visual processing, as will much of the content of this week. And here really, we will be looking at an early visual cortex, which means what are the early processes by which we take in sensation, and from that pattern, we try to infer the presence, for example, of lines, of edges, of corners, that sort of thing. And then from there, we will look at how there are two different pathways that information that reaches us in the visual hierarchy gets processed through. One is the so-called what pathway, a pathway that is very important for identifying, for finding out the identity of what it is that you're looking at, and the where and how pathways. This is to say, a pathway that is important for detecting where something is in space and how can you interact with it. So let's get started.